Hello there, good morning. As Israel intensifies its aggression in southern Syria, the region faces an unprecedented level of escalation. With Israeli occupation forces conducting airstrikes and military incursions into Syrian territory, the civilian toll continues to rise. The Syrian government has condemned these actions, calling for international pressure on Israel to cease its violations. As tensions between Israel and Syria escalate, will global diplomatic efforts be sufficient to halt Israel's aggression? How will the situation unfold in the coming days? Welcome to In Depth. In a notable escalation, an Israeli airstrike on Tuesday has killed several people in southwestern Syria as Israeli troops clashed with local residents in the area. That's according to The Independent. Israeli occupation forces seized a UN-monitored buffer zone inside Syria. This follows the end of the Bashar al-Assad regime in December, with Israeli officials saying they will thwart any threats. Both Syrian authorities and UN officials have accused Israel of violating the 1974 agreement that established the buffer zone along the border, demanding Israel's withdrawal. Meanwhile, the spokesperson for an investigative committee probing the recent clashes in Syria's coastal region, where hundreds of civilians were killed, reported nearly 100 testimonies had been heard and dozens of written and recorded statements from civilians and military personnel had been collected. Israeli airstrikes on Syria's Daraa province continue to escalate, with 5 civilians confirmed dead. The strikes are part of Israel's ongoing aggression on southern Syria.
In a recent escalation, Israeli occupation forces struck 2 major Syrian military bases, Tadmor and T4, in Syria's Homs province on Tuesday, citing threats posed by their military capabilities. The raids occurred despite warnings from EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas that increased Israeli strikes in Syria and Lebanon risk worsening regional tensions. Meanwhile, at least 5 people were killed in Israeli shelling in western Daraa province in southern Syria, according to local authorities. In a statement, the Daraa governor's office confirmed that several others, including a woman, were also injured when Israeli forces staged an incursion, followed by artillery shelling. Since the end of Bashar al-Assad's rule, Israel has expanded its control over the Syrian Golan Heights by seizing the demilitarized buffer zone, a move that violated the 1974 disengagement agreement with Syria. Reports also indicate hundreds of Israeli airstrikes targeting Syrian military sites, including fighter jets, missile systems, and air defenses. Moreover, Syria's foreign ministry has accused Israel of undermining the country's stability, condemning the attacks as violations of sovereignty. The intensified aggression has caused widespread displacement, while Israel justifies the strikes as necessary for national security. As Syria calls for international intervention and Israel vows to continue its operations, a critical question remains: will diplomatic efforts prevail, or will the violence escalate further?
Now, to hopefully answer these questions for us, we are joined from Cairo by Abdulrahman Raboua, who is a Syrian journalist and writer. We're also joined by Ameni Soliman, who is a director of the Mediterranean Studies Institute. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for being here on the program. Mr. Rabour, we'll begin with you. So Israel has been carrying out regular strikes in southern Syria, and including these recent attacks in the Dara province. What would you say are the underlying goals of these attacks?
Thanks for having me. Since December 8th, 2024, the occupation state is regularly striking Syria, targeting all the strategic warehouse of the arms and ammunition. Accompanied by, on daily basis, killing tens of Syrians throughout 3 months, and these strikes still longer with the extensions of the ground, while the Israeli troops encouraged the 10 kilometers of the Syrian territories into the east that reached Damascus city and the top of the Sheikh mountain, and also heading to Al-Dara governorate, targeting several casualties of lives, along with destructions of infrastructure under the pretext of the presence of armed factions and arms. And I think that the Israeli entity thinks Syrian that posing a great threat to Israel as pretexting the uncertainty status along with the start of, or rather launching a new regime. No one expect any facts about it, particularly that this new administration coming from an jihadist background. That's why Israeli fears of the threat against Israel, and therefore doing these illegal measures violating the international law, despite the affirmation by the government or the new administration that they are peaceful, wishing for a normalization to pursue the peace and stability in the region, affirmed by all international and Arab partners that dealt with the new Syrian administration. They issued a statement either from Cairo or in Saudi and Jordan, affirmed, and even by the EU and Turkey and Syria, affirmed that there is a great desire from the Syrians to have a peaceful state and to prevent any state of war along the region. But all these matters do not convince the Israelis.
Okay. And coming to you, Dr. Soliman, how do you assess the global community's response so far to these Israeli violations of Syrian sovereignty?
Well, we have seen yesterday in the UN, it's true that the Israeli attacks were condemned, but at the same time, there is still uncertainty of how the situation would develop in Syria with too many regional players who are counted as enemies or possible enemies of Israel. So while the international community does not approve what Israel is doing by bombing Syrian military targets, at the same time, the international community itself put Syria yesterday in a place where they want to have answers, a list of demands in order to ease the sanctions on Syria that has been on the table for decades. So the international community sees in the interim government of Syria today a possible threat for both their jihadi or Islamic background. This is one. Two, because they might have inherited some of the storage of the claimed the so-called chemical weapons of al-Assad regime. So the international community does condemn what Israel is doing, but at the same time, they see some kind of justification, if I may use the word, for Israel's worrisome from the current Syrian administration. Also, they see it as from certain aspect, they see it as Israel is trying to mitigate any reloading or rearming of militias backed by Iran that would cause violence or tension or insurgencies on the Israeli borders.
I'll stay with you, Dr. Sonneman, for a moment. You mentioned there's some very interesting points about the international community and their thinking that there is some justification for Israel's action. You mentioned the possibility of the remnants of chemical weapons that Assad may have had in the past being perhaps a factor. Do you see that there's any justification?
I don't see it as justification, and there is no justification whatsoever for what Israel has been doing since its establishment till today. But I'm telling you what the international community would see, especially when it's supported by the Americans. The Americans released a list of demands to the Syrian government, the Syrian interim government, saying that they are afraid that foreign fighters are going to hold positions in the Syrian government, that they want a complete destruction of any weapons of mass destruction, especially the chemical weapons. So when you release such demands at the same time that Israel is striking Syrian military bases and warehouses, it sends a message that it's not just a worry from Israel, it's a worry shared by the Americans and perhaps shared by Western Europe, that Syria can do harm to Israel. In this case, the global community, even if it condemns what Israel is doing, but it sees a part of it as joint worries about a government that has a violent background and at the same time seizing the capabilities of the old regime that was bluntly threatening Israel.
Okay, and coming back to you, Mr. Raboa, how significant is Israel's continued military occupation in the demilitarized zone in the Golan Heights? What does this say for Syrian sovereignty?
Israeli or unilateral Israeli measures are going through at a larger scale in this interim term in the history of Syria, as coming out of civil year that lasted for 14 years and for more than 4 million out of Syria that were displaced. Syria is in dire need of more time for heal their wounds, and the Israeli measures are condemned by Syria and their friends. And what the Israelis doing is going in the path of complicating the matters in Syria, and that might lead that Israel might be having a retaliation from the Syrian side. And everyone knows that the current administration in Syria is completely different from the former Assad regime. And therefore, such a new interim administration found themselves are in a very tight corner due to the Israeli aggressions, and I think it is for the international community should convince Israelis to halt this unreasonable aggression lead to more casualties of civilians, and Syrians might take a new, different stance compared to the previous ones.
Mr. Raboa there mentions the international community taking a stand. Dr. Suleiman, the EU has voiced deep concern over Israel's actions in Syria. Do you think there's any chance that European diplomacy could effectively influence Israel to de-escalate? It doesn't seem to have had much luck with that in other conflicts.
Israel is not in a place to act according to international community standards. They would have done this with Gaza, that they are have been launching a genocidal war on Gaza for a year and a half now. So I don't think that the international community or the EU or anyone can really put pressures on the Israelis to stop what they are doing. According to certain dynamics in Israeli domestic politics and also on military arrangements, Israel is just going to do what it has to do or what it sees as in its interests to the end. And that reminds us that Golani or Ahmed al-Shara, when he seized power in Syria in December on the very early days of the fall of the Assad regime, Israel was attacking the bases, and he didn't say a word. And even after this, when he declared that we are not going into conflict with Israel now, but we want them to respect our sovereignty and so on, the attacks didn't stop. We have 500 airstrikes on Syria since December on different scales and different military targets, air forces, and so on. So I don't think that the international community is going to do anything more than to condemn and to have some big words and strong words here and there. And again, every time they are condemning what Israel is doing in Syria, in the same statement, you would find something about what happened on the Syrian coast, about the sectarian tensions and the attacks against the Alawite minority, or you would find something about the worries about the storage of Assad regime chemical weapons and so on. So all the time, even when they are trying to condemn what Israel is doing, at the same text, they put a justification to say that they understand somehow, even if it's not said loudly, they understand somehow why Israel is doing what it's doing. And Netanyahu, by the way, and this is also declared since December, he said that the disengagement agreement is obsolete. He saw that because the Syrian military forces are not in their places anymore on the edge of the demilitarized zone. He doesn't have to commit to the disengagement of 1974, the disengagement plan agreement any longer. So even now, if the UN is discussing this matter, we have to remember that the Israelis themselves said that it's not valid any longer.
And obviously, Mr. Raboa, when there was a change of leadership in Damascus after Assad's ousting, there was a lot going on at the time. But do you think that the new leadership was a little bit slow to react to what Israel was doing? And with the current situation and the repeated attacks on military sites in Syria, do you think we are likely to see a real further escalation in the region?
as we've seen previously in the past period, there was some sort of a confirmation by the new interim administration and the interim president al-Shara that Syria in the process of reconstruction and bifurcating the previous era. Along with that, there are priorities that are focusing of the reconstruction and the return of the fled Syrian and the re-establishing diplomatic relations that should be based on friendship with the neighboring countries along with other Western countries. Particularly, there were some confirmation towards Israel stating that Syria isn't going to engage in a conflict with Israel, particularly why Israel already completely destroyed the military infrastructures, and all the pretexts are false. Israel is only exploiting the matters in a bid to recrystallize a new Middle East that go in line with their plans along with their allies of full control in the region and re-establishing an entity that should be biased to the West and not peaceful for the neighboring countries. Israel wishes economic and political homogeny in the region along with its ally. Despite the Syrian confirmation, this Israeli brutal, systematic Israeli pressure of Israel is still in place, along with the escalation of killing more civilians, along with the popular resistance that has started to be crystallized in Dura and Kumaira from this area by the people who had to not to respond to the Syrian resolution by defending themselves, their resources in return of the Israeli aggressions and the unacceptable Israeli incursion that usually would lead to civil casualties, more destruction of infrastructures, citizen housing, and the cutting of the olive trees and several aspects of the livelihood of the Syrians in this such a region. And therefore,
well, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're just out of time, unfortunately. But it's been a fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank both of my guests on In Depth this morning, Abdulrahman Raboa, a Syrian journalist and writer, and Dr. Amani Sonaman, who's the director of the Mediterranean Studies Institute. Thank you both for joining us here on Q News. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Thanks for tuning in and joining us, and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.